Welcome to another episode of Forgotten Uniques. In this series, I'm covering unique items in Path of Exile that aren't used very much, if at all, taking a look at how exactly they function and how their mechanics interact with other parts of the game, especially recent additions such as ascendancy changes or new unique items. Today's video is all about Replica Nebulis, a unique sceptre which was introduced into the game in patch 3.12 Heist League and can only be obtained from the end reward from a Grand Heist. Let's take a look at the modifiers on Replica Nebulis. You'll immediately notice that this item doesn't have too much going on. It has just 3 modifiers, with 2 of them being the unique modifiers on this item and the last being a generic cast speed roll. 15 to 20% increased cast speed is around the equivalent of a tier 4 cast speed roll on a crafted sceptre, so nothing to write home about there, but this is still going to be a useful stat for most of the builds that will want to use this sceptre. Then we're moving on to the 2 special modifiers on this unique sceptre. 15 to 20% increased cold damage per 1% missing cold resistance, up to a maximum of 300%, and 15 to 20% increased fire damage per 1% of missing fire resistance, up to a maximum of 300%. So the terminology used here, missing resistance, is the amount of resistance that you don't have below your maximum resistance cap. For example, by default a character will have the base maximum resistance of 75%. If that character gathered enough cold resistance, for example, so that they had 70% cold resistance, they'd have 5% missing cold resistance. That's 5% missing resistance below the cap of 75%, and therefore by equipping a Replica Nebulis, they'd gain 15 to 20% increased cold damage per percent missing. So in the case of, let's say, a Replica Nebulis with a max roll of 20% increased cold damage, the character would be gaining 100% increased cold damage because they have 5% missing cold resistance. So unlike the normal Nebulis unique sceptre, which incentivizes you to increase and cap out your maximum resistances in order to gain damage, the Replica Nebulis sceptre is incentivizing you to keep your cold and fire resistances below their cap. Both of these modifiers have a maximum increased damage cap of 300% each. So if you had the maximum 20% increased cold or lightning damage roll on these modifiers, you'd need 15% missing resistance to gain the maximum 300% increased damage from the respective modifier. Meanwhile, with a minimum roll of 15% increased damage, you'd need 20% missing resistance to reach that 300% cap. An important note here is that the 300% increased damage cap on these modifiers is global, meaning that double-wielding Replica Nebulis will only provide increased damage up to the respective cap of 300% for each damage type. So if you're already capping out that 300% increase from wielding a single Replica Nebulis, you'll be gaining no additional benefit from equipping a second one. Alright, so how can you go about making use of Replica Nebulis? Let's first take a look at the offensive side of this unique sceptre. To make full use of this item, you'll want to be gaining the full 300% increased damage to both cold and fire damage, and this will leave you with a few options in the way of building your offense. The first is going to be a cold damage ability which inflicts Ignite. This could be a pure cold damage ability, or an ability that originates as physical damage which is then converted to cold damage. Both the increased cold damage and the increased fire damage from Replica Nebulis will scale the resulting Ignite. To inflict an Ignite though, the damage must be dealt as fire damage by default, so you need to convert the cold damage to fire damage using mechanics such as the Pyro unique ring, cold to fire support, or Avatar of Fire. However, you can inflict Ignite with cold damage without the need to convert the damage to fire by using other mechanics like the 3 Dragons unique helmet, or the Elementalist's Shaper of Flames Ascendancy Notable. Another, more commonly explored option is going to be a hit-based build which uses a damage conversion chain to deal fire damage. Ideally, the fire damage originated as physical damage, which was converted first into cold damage and then into fire damage. For example, Glacial Cascade, or its transfigured version, Glacial Cascade of the Fissure. These abilities deal base physical damage, of which 100% is converted to cold damage. You could then use cold to fire support along with Avatar of Fire to convert 100% of that cold damage into fire damage. By doing this, you'll fully benefit from the 300% increased damage of each type gained from Replica Nebulis. But be aware that each portion of increased damage will only scale damage of its respective type. For example, physical as extra fire damage modifiers will only be scaled by the increased fire damage on Replica Nebulis, while modifiers that provide physical damage as extra cold damage will be scaled by both. For that reason, physical damage as extra cold damage modifiers are incredibly valuable in such a build. Meanwhile, modifiers which grant non-chaos damage as extra chaos damage are also very valuable, as they'll grant damage for each part of the damage conversion chain. Alright, so what about actually gaining that maximum 300% increased damage for both cold and fire damage from Replica Nebulis? How bad is it having missing resistance below your maximum resistance cap? Well, let's take a look. Spoiler, it's pretty bad. As an example then, let's say a character takes a hit of 5,000 fire damage and they have 75% fire resistance. Their resistance mitigates 75% of the damage and they take 1,250 fire damage. If the same character had a max rolled Replica Nebulis and they instead had 60% fire resistance to be able to gain the full 300% increased fire damage, they take 2,000 fire damage from the same 5,000 fire damage hit, or an effective 60% more damage taken than they would have with 75% fire resistance. Like I said, that's pretty bad. So how do you go about using this item? Well, you could consider scaling your maximum cold and fire resistances so that the amount of resistance that you have with missing resistances is higher. For example, if a character managed to increase their maximum cold and fire resistances by 10% each, from the default 75% cap up to 85%, they would then be able to reach the 300% increased damage cap by obtaining 70% of each respective resistance. If we run the same example from earlier then, the character which takes a hit of 5,000 fire damage. With 85% fire resistance, they'd mitigate 85% of the damage and take 750 fire damage. With 70% fire resistance, they'd mitigate 70% of the damage and take 1,500 fire damage, or an effective 100% more damage taken compared to having resistances capped at 85%. Not only is this worse, but it's a lot worse considering you've invested heavily into maximum resistance scaling as well. The character is taking less damage than they would have done without scaling maximum resistances, but the investment just isn't worth it. This is definitely not the way you'd want to utilise Replica Nebulis. The best option you're going to have available to you to use this item is to shift fire and cold damage that you take into other damage types so that you can largely ignore scaling your fire and cold resistances. The Divine Flesh Timeless Keystone will allow you to shift 50% of this damage to be taken as chaos damage, and it also provides 5% maximum chaos resistance to help you mitigate that portion of the shifted damage. But do be aware that this keystone will prevent your energy shield from performing its normal function of absorbing damage. From there, you can make use of the Font of Thunder, a unique shield which makes 40% of fire and cold damage be taken as lightning damage instead. With this setup, you'll be taking 90% of all incoming fire and cold damage as chaos or lightning damage, leaving only 10% of the originating damage type. The remaining 10% of damage can still deal a considerable amount of damage to you if you leave those resistances at their base minus 60% however, so I'd still recommend investing a small amount into boosting those resistances into the positives. You can also consider something like the Juggernaut's Unbreakable Ascendancy Notable, paired with the Armour and Energy Shield Mastery which applies 10% of armour to chaos damage taken from hits. This combination works great with this type of setup because armour is applied separately to each damage type, meaning the full 8% armour calculation from Unbreakable would be applied to that 10% portion of the damage which remains as the originating damage type, and it would also be applied separately to the 40% portion of the damage which is shifted to be taken as lightning damage. Meanwhile, 10% of the armour would be being applied to the remaining 50% of the damage that's been shifted to be taken as chaos damage, thanks to the Armour and Energy Shield Mastery, and all of these armour calculations occur post-resistance mitigation. This is why the 5% maximum resistance gain from Divine Flesh is so beneficial, while you could also consider scaling your maximum lightning resistance with this kind of setup, using things such as Purity of Lightning. I should also mention another option that you have available, although I don't recommend it. The Flawed Refuge is another unique shield which will make you take 40% of elemental damage from hits as physical damage instead. However, be aware that this modifier only works for hits, so when combined with Divine Flesh, you'll still be taking 50% of elemental damage over time as elemental damage, and that portion of the damage is going to kill you very quickly if you have low or no resistances of that type. Now, the Replica Nebulis unique sceptre is barely being used at all in all versions of Necropolis League, and I think this video has done a decent job of showcasing why that's the case. The modifiers which provide increased damage realistically should have higher caps so that more damage can be gained for the sacrifice that you're making to your defences to enable this unique weapon. With that said, however, the very specific setup using Divine Flesh and the Font of Thunder is at least serviceable, albeit very niche. And I don't really expect too many characters to use this item in the future unless it receives some buffs or some other tools which provide synergy to boost its effectiveness. Thank you to my patrons for your ongoing support of my channel. If you enjoy the content I make here on YouTube, you can find all of the information about becoming a patron by following the link in the description to Patreon. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.